In the weeks after the Michael Brown shooting, many in the media adopted a narrative that a rogue police officer in Ferguson murdered an unarmed, innocent black man, what came to be called the hands up, don't shoot narrative.
To be clear, we need to hear from all the witnesses. But these two witnesses describe what seems to me to be a cold-blooded murder.
I don't have an answer that is palatable to be able to look at my children in the face and say there are people in this country who not only do not like African Americans, but they despise black men. There is a war on black boys in this country.
We want you to know that our hearts are out there marching with them.
I kept warning the news business was rushing to judgment based almost solely on accounts sympathetic to Brown. I do think that we still don't know what the police version is of exactly what happened, and so a lot of the coverage up until now had been kind of one-sided because we just haven't had access to the other side. Are the ideological media, in this case on the left, adding to the polarization in this particular sensitive, racially charged story? And I'll tell you something else that I'm concerned about, Megan, and that is some liberal outlets creating almost a lynch mob mentality around this. So now that two investigations have found that Officer Darren Wilson acted properly in self-defense, why aren't more news organizations examining where they went wrong or even apologizing? Joining us now from New York, Joe Concha, a columnist for Mediaite, and here in Washington, Susan Ferricchio, chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner, and Richard Fowler, syndicated radio talk show host who's reported from Ferguson. Joe Concha, other than the Washington Post, Jonathan Capehart, and a couple of others, I haven't seen many journalists or news organizations sort of openly grappling with the role that they played in perpetuating a false narrative. What do you think?
Nor have I, Howie, and kudos to Jonathan Capehart, by the way, because he was under no duress to say that he had made an error, and he went full Washington Post in his column, didn't do it on Twitter at 1 o'clock in the morning, and he's now being called a race traitor for doing so by the lynch mob on social media. But, you know, there are real victims here, Howie, as far as Ferguson is concerned, and those are Ferguson residents themselves. If you look at a report by Fusion, that's the ABC Univision joint venture, Daniel Rivero, a reporter there, actually studied home property values before the protests in August and what they are now, and they're nearly down 50%. And most of these people weren't even protesting. It's a predominantly black community, and now they're seeing their homes drop from, say, $65,000 to $35,000, what they are now. Real victims here. Apologies need to be made, Howie.
Susan, initially news organizations relied on some friends of Brown who were lying, one who said shot in the back. Police department wasn't talking. It's interesting, New York Times Ombudsman Margaret Sullivan now says she was wrong to challenge the paper for quoting unnamed sources as saying Darren Wilson had reason to fear Michael Brown. So what do you think about why there's been very little soul-searching on this?
Well, I find what's really interesting, too, is if you look at the mea culpa in the New York Times, the comment section, to me, is what's really fascinating about this. One commenter suggested that what journalists had committed was malpractice. And I think that's a really interesting way to term this. You know, what is our responsibility as reporters, making sure that both sides of the story are presented? Clearly, in this case, I never, like you, I never felt both sides were fairly presented, and that it drove a narrative that created part of the furor in Ferguson that a lot of people who lived there paid for dearly. There are also people who commented on that mea culpa in the New York Times who are from Ferguson, who said they were driven from their homes and who watched the media only interview or tell part of the story. So I'm not as interested in apologies as I am in lessons learned. What can we do going forward if something like this happens again?
Right, that's not just ancient history for these people. Richard Fowler, is it fair, let's start with this, to say that many in the media, whether inadvertently or recklessly, pursued a false narrative and have never really corrected it?
Well, I agree with Susan to some extent. I think you're right. There's two sides of the story, and one side was missing. And I think the reason why that side was missing, Howard, has everything to do with the fact they didn't speak up. The police were pretty much mum when it came to talking about what really took place that night.
Does that let journalists off the hook?
No, not at all. But I think this narrative, the hands up, don't shoot. I get why there's not truth to it from the Department of Justice report, but it sort of transcends just the Michael Brown case. I think hands up, don't shoot represents a feeling of minorities, black and brown folks, sort of the feeling that they feel towards the police for mistreatment. And I think just like all throughout history, you have don't overtax me. You have we shall overcome. It's become a narrative for a larger problem.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wonder whether the people who, and particularly in the media, who embraced hands up, don't shoot, then quickly pivoted to the larger question or the related question of a history of police department discrimination against African Americans, but never really cleaned up the mess about this particular case and the shooting of Michael Brown, because you go to the larger question.
No, I think you're right. I think they should have cleaned up the Michael Brown scenario, and I give Jonathan Capehart kudos. But like I said, I think this transcends beyond just Ferguson. And I think the reason why it's been a rally cry, and I think the media has reported on the rally cry, and I think that's an important thing. And I think to add to that point, I think, if we're going to talk about Ferguson and St. Louis and St. Louis County, you missed the underlying story here. You have 90 municipalities in a small county. The reason why they have this situation is because of really bad governance. And there's a lot of journalists like Yamiche Alcindor from USA Today that talked about the backstory of how we got to Michael Brown, because it could have been, Joe Louis for that matter. It could have been anybody that created the situation that happened in Ferguson.
All right, let me go back to Joe Concha. After the Iraq War, there was a lot of breastfeeding and mea culpas and editor's notes about the way in which the press should have been more aggressive in challenging the Bush administration on whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And I'm seeing very little of that now. Why do you think that is?
I think because a Republican was probably in office, Howie, and to say that President Bush was wrong, that's easy to sell, particularly when his poll numbers were going down 2005, 2006, once it was revealed that weapons of mass destruction probably didn't exist. So I think it's a lot easier to say that a president made a mistake than to say we made a mistake. And finally, with opinion journalism, you could just say, well, hey, I was just offering an opinion and I got it wrong, even though they're not saying they got it wrong. It's not like news anchors were coming out and pushing that as fact. So I think you could hide behind the fact that, hey, I was just offering an opinion. No big deal. We get it right. We get it wrong. That's what we're paid for. So I think that's kind of an excuse.
The CNN anchors who put the hands up in a gesture of solidarity, that was a news show. It wasn't a commentary show.
Have you noticed, and I'm sure you have, that media, particularly television media, has sort of slanted more toward the opinions versus just hardline journalism of the past 10 years ago, 20 years ago? That's sort of a culmination of it. And I think that really what needs to happen is for everybody in the media who considers themselves to be a nonpartisan, middle-of-the-road journalist, an objective journalist, to take a look at their behavior on this issue in particular, so that going forward we can be more objective and retain our credibility, which is what's a big part of this.
Because there will be other criminal cases where all the facts won't be out there at once. Last word, Richard.
Oh, I tend to agree with that, but I think that there's something missing here. I get it. Those reporters to put their hand, I guess you'd call them reporters or journalists or commentators to put their hands up. It's because this issue is something that transcended journalism.
But the thing at the heart of it was false. According to Eric Holder's Justice Department,
I agree.
He did not have his hands up. So
I agree. I think it's a larger, and if you look at in the clip there, Sonny Hostas had, I can't breathe, which is another rally cry from the Eric Garner case. I think there's a larger narrative at play here, and I think that's the bigger issue.
All right, Richard Fowler, thanks for joining us today.